So today we're making a brand new tier list, ranking every meta unit in Universal Tower Defense as of the biggest update ever, Update 4.0. Keep in mind the rankings in this video are just my own opinion, but I still hope you find the video helpful. If you do, give me a like or subscribe. But anyways, let's get into it. Right, hello guys, so we're making a new tier list today, which is pretty much guaranteed to be scuffed because we got 24 new units this update. So we're going to keep it pretty brief with the explanations, and I also got the older units already ranked here out of the way. If you have any questions about them, you can always check out my older tier list video from a couple weeks ago. Starting off with the Bleach units, first up here we have the Unrivaled. Now Grimmy's actually really good. His whole gimmick is like having multiple different forms and cloned units, so he has like 4 different forms to choose from. A couple of them are good for support, one of them is for hybrid, a couple of them are really good for DPS. But regardless of what form you pick on this guy, he's just really strong. His DPS is really good, his clones are also pretty good. He also has some supporting value because whenever his clones like expire, they have like a timer. Whenever they expire, they stun everything in range, so he has a pretty good uptime on stun. So yeah, Grimmy's actually really good. His DPS is kind of crazy if you use him right, and he kind of makes the core of Bleach teams right now. Next up we have Yuhaba, which is also a really strong unit. And similar to Grimmy, he does have multiple forms as well. So Yuhaba has 2 forms, he has a buffing one and a damaged one. Now the buffing form is going to have different buffs depending on what game mode you're in, but even though all the buffs are different for each game mode or whatever, all of his buffs are pretty strong. So regardless of what game mode you're in, he's going to be a very strong buffer. Definitely going into the support tier if you use his buff mode. But he also has a damage mode, so aside from the buffing, he also is just really good for DPS and full AoE and hybrid. The way his damage mode works is he actually loses damage and range when you have units in his range, so you want to keep him kind of on his own. But for some weird reason, he also gains like 35% damage per unit in his range, and caps out at 150%. So I don't know, there's probably a sweet spot where you want to kind of place some units in his range to get his like 150% damage buff or whatever. I don't know, he's kind of weird, but it's kind of the gist of the unit. He's got a damage mode, a buffing mode, and both of them are very strong for what they do. Ichigo, not gonna lie, I'm kind of disappointed by it. Even though it is a pretty cool and pretty strong unit, I'd put him probably like up here in meta overall for now. He's kind of boring because of how he's like very similar to these other 2 units right next to him. His main gimmick is going to be his active ability, which is kind of how all these Bleach units here work. In my opinion, it's kind of boring, so I'm not very hyped for this Ichigo unit, I don't know. But you use Ichigo's ability, he goes into like a super beast mode form, whatever, and does a lot more damage. He just kind of does a burst of damage, then goes back into human form and does like nothing for a little bit. He has some downtime after. Overall, he has good DPS and some supporting value, but I don't know, we'll talk about Rukia and Yamamoto next, and they're very similar to Ichigo, in that they're kind of like burst damage units. They're good for maybe boss killing or like nuking something, and then the rest of the time they're just kind of okay. They definitely are still meta. Rukia, in my opinion, is pretty disappointing. She had potential to be a very good support because she has freeze, she has slow, and a chance to confuse enemies during the freeze. But a weird thing about Rukia and Yamamoto is like their passives kind of conflict with what they're meant to do, because every time Rukia attacks a frozen enemy, she's going to remove the freeze and do bonus damage. And then very similar to Ichigo, she has an ability that kind of goes like beast mode. She gets like hyper buff for a little bit, does a lot more damage. I don't know, personally I wish she was more like support oriented, which she definitely still is okay for the confusion, freeze, and slow, but I don't know, she gets rid of it to do a lot more damage, and that's kind of her whole thing. It's just burst damage like Ichigo with his Bankai ability. She has her Bankai ability. And Yamamoto, same exact thing. He has an ability where he kind of goes crazy, gets a lot of damage for a little bit, and then summons a bunch of stuff on the track as well, so he kind of has like a cool ability with that part. But yeah, Ichigo, Rukia, and Yamamoto. All 3 of them, you could tell me we're the same exact unit, I would believe you, because their whole point is just use their ability, and they get really strong for a little bit. And Yamamoto, similar to Rukia for some reason, he's a burn unit by the way, of course, if you couldn't tell, because he's always a burn unit. Yamamoto has like a really good amount of burn damage, and then every time he attacks a burning enemy, he gets rid of the burn to deal like 75% extra damage on the attack. Even though his burn does like 180% of his damage, so it's kind of more worthwhile to just have them burning. But yeah, I don't know what they did, man. The passives are kind of conflicting with Rukia and Yamamoto. Kind of just gets rid of their whole effect to do a little bit more damage. Uryu is a heal unit, and he's also kind of a support. Not really, but like he can cleanse debuffs on allies, so that's kind of helpful. But he's a pretty okay heal unit. He's probably going into like the bottom of meta overall. His damage is pretty good. He has a lot of range, and I don't know, that's really all there is to say about him. He's not too special. Yoruichi kind of has a cool design, I think. He has like a meter she builds up and turns into cat form. I'm not really sure what that even does. There's no other passive that like talks about her cat form, but if she builds up a meter, every attack does like chain lightning to enemies around, so similar to King Sailor with the chain lightning thing. And her damage looks pretty low, but she also has really low SPA, so she attacks really often. But her actual passives are like kind of boring. If she's not in cat form, she does extra damage to hyper armor, so I guess that's like the one point of going into cat form is just to kind of nerfs her. I don't know. And when she attacks something that's stun, she applies slow, and then when she attacks something that has slow, she applies stun. So she probably has like some pretty good support and stalling with stun and slow looping. But I don't know, overall I think she's just kind of pretty good. Damage is alright, and her support is alright. Next up we have Fear, or Asnot. This guy is purely a support unit. He has no damage and no upgrades, so all he can really do is support. He's very expensive to place down, that kind of holds him back from being a really good support. He can slow and rewind enemies and make them take plus 50% more damage from, I think, all sources. And he's going to make the enemies randomly start attacking each other, so I'm not sure what that really means, but I don't know, I guess they'll kind of damage each other or maybe knock each other back. And then for units with the Hollow Destroyers tag, he's going to give them a 50% multiplicative damage buff, so pretty strong there. I don't know, overall he's just an okay support. If he didn't cost so much, he'd be really good. Unohana is a bleed unit, as expected. At max upgrade, she's full AoE, and she applies bleed and blood loss onto stuff, and blood loss is just going to make bleed stronger. Really, she's just a bleed unit, and then if Berserker's in her range, she sacrifices half her damage and gives him 100% of her damage. And then every 30 seconds, she cleanses debuffs from every ally in range. And every time she cleanses a debuff, she gains a little bit more damage. I don't know, overall, just a full AoE bleed unit, kind of a support, but not really, just for debuff cleansing. Going into the good tier, she's just kind of alright. Giselle, another one that is also just kind of alright, and I'm really kind of disappointed with this one. I don't know, all the unit designs in this update feel a little bit rushed, in my opinion. Like, every unit altogether from this update feels like they weren't fully done with a lot of them. Aside from the numerous bugs we got on launch and the bugs that are still in the game as I'm making this video, a lot of the passives just like are worded really weird or don't really make sense for what the unit's trying to do. And Giselle is one where like the unit design is just way too gimmicky. I don't know if they thought through if this unit would ever even be like helpful. But every few attacks, Giselle is going to apply bleed onto enemies that will drain them down to 1 HP and cannot kill them. And once the enemies are on 1 HP, it's going to turn them into zombie summons for 25% of his damage. So a really weird way of summoning stuff that just isn't very practical like at all. Because how often are you actually going to have something die to that bleed and like get down to 1% HP instead of just dying to one of your other units, because you're not going to use this guy alone. So I don't know, it's not a bad unit. If you have the summons going, it's a pretty good amount of damage, but just way too gimmicky. I feel like it doesn't even really have a use in the meta. Next up we have the death dealing guy, Askin I think his name is. He applies poison onto stuff, and when enemies with poison die, it like spreads to nearby enemies. Then he has a domain that I think is always active, not an active ability. It's just like always going, where enemies in his domain get poisoned, and dot damage is buffed by 25% in the domain, which is pretty good support if you run him on a dot team with like burn or something. And he's also immune to every debuff, and when a debuff tries to apply onto him, he gets buffed to get more damage and lower SPA, and that's kind of it. He's an okay poison unit. He's okay for like dot teams, I'd imagine, but just kind of good. Pretty sure this is Asura from the video game. I don't remember what video game, but it's in Anime Vanguards now. So this unit has burn, and burn ticks faster, but does the same amount of damage, but just ticks down faster the closer the enemies are to him. And then whenever he's attacking, he builds up a rage bar, and when that fills up, he does like an extra burst of damage. He also has some pretty good passives for shield breaking and hyper armor breaking, but overall, I mean, the damage is okay, and maybe if you need hyper armor breaking, that'd be good, like situationally. He's just kind of alright in the meta. Firefly, her entire gimmick is she builds up stacks on stuff that make them weak to her, so like she does more damage to them, and make the enemies take more damage from fire units, so she's kind of an okay support I guess in that way. But then whenever she attacks, she removes the stacks that enemies have on them, and does an extra burst of damage. But otherwise she has a meter she fills up over time, and when it fills up she turns into a mech. The mech is just kind of like raw DPS with burn, follow-up attacks, and just pretty high damage. I don't know, man, I'm kind of getting sick of the units in this update that, like, their passive is just, whoa, we can do a burst of damage, you know, we can chunk something down out of nowhere, and let's give them, like, 10% hyper armor damage for no reason. That'll definitely make them a good unit. And then this unit applies a debuff on the enemy, but when it attacks it, it takes it away. Like, I don't know. I don't understand why so many units in this update feel like they are almost the exact same cookie cutter, but they change a couple details, and, like, the details don't really do anything to the unit. I don't know. Overall, this unit is strong. Like, the damage is good when you get into mech form, but I'm just kind of mad about how this was hyped up to be the biggest update ever, and they'd take their time, and this was, like, combined into 4 updates, so nothing would be rushed or buggy, and it all ended up rushed and buggy. Like, we ran into so many bugs on launch, and these unit designs are just kind of redundant. Like, the units are all doing the same thing. Simon, unfortunately, this guy is a poo-poo stinker, dude. I don't know what it is about him. Apparently there's a bug going on with him, so maybe he's just bugged right now and his damage will be way higher later. I wouldn't be surprised if like half the units I'm ranking today are bugged and it'll be better later, or if they like emergency patch and change some stuff. I don't know. But Simon seems horrible, bro. He's actually bad. Not like unusable. You know, he's still good. He's going into the good tier. Probably like below Freerin. But this guy attacks from a mech. He summons a mech on the track and it attacks for him. And it ramps up over time, gaining charge every time it attacks. And when the charge reaches certain thresholds, he gets like little tiny buffs with him. Then if you have other units in his range, he reduces his SPA up to 20%. Then his main gimmick, I guess, is that he has 3 different active abilities. The first one is going to let him choose between 2 different forms. One of the forms makes him hybrid. The other form gives him a little bit of extra hyper armor damage. I'm still mad about that. That just so many units up they have a random extra hyper armor damage bonus, like it's a real passive to give them. His second ability though, remember he has 3. His second ability lets you control the mech, kind of like Kaido's dragon, but it's really clunky and not really good at all. So probably don't control the mech. And then the third ability is a nuke, but I don't know how much damage it does. They don't really have it anywhere listed in the ability or the passive, so I don't know. Hopefully they update that one day and add it into the passive somewhere, but he has a nuke for I don't know how much damage. So that's cool. Next, we're getting into the Marvel units, or the Spider-Man units. So first up, we have the Alien Spider Synchro between Venom and Spider-Man. This unit actually has some crazy DPS with follow-up attacks, similar to like Vegeta Blue, kinda, with follow-up attacks being the whole gimmick. But he also has some pretty okay supporting value. Whenever he kills an enemy, they place down a web trap on the track, and enemies who walk on that web trap get stunned and permanently slowed by 45%. And he makes enemies take 50% more damage from dark units, including himself. Overall, just a really good DPS unit with some supporting value. The Mechanical Spider Synchro between Iron Man and Spider-Man. It does some really good damage. It has follow-up attacks similar to the other Spider-Man form, but this one's follow-up attacks are true damage, so that's kind of helpful. And it builds up nanotech on enemies, which is a new debuff. It goes up to 5 stacks, and at the max amount of stacks from nanotech, enemies take 25% of his damage every second, and 40% more damage from all sources, and are slowed by 20%. Iron Man is actually a really strong unit. We're going to put him into meta overall right about here. He's mostly a really good support, but the way he works is he has 3 different forms to choose from an active ability. The form you want to use most of the time is the buffing one. He has a really good damage buff to all units in his range. I think it's a damage, range, and SPA buff, so really good overall. But he also has a damage form. The damage form does pretty good DPS with the follow-up attacks and burn. Otherwise, the third form, I kind of forgot. It's not very important. You usually just put this guy in defense mode, which is the buffing one. But he's a heal unit, so going into meta heal / hybrid. And definitely a very, very good support. That's kind of his main thing, because even aside from his damage buff in defense mode, he also buffs your farms by 20% income for some reason. So the 20% income buff itself is also very, very strong. Very, very good support. Venom is an okay support. His own personal DPS is kind of mid. You wouldn't really want to use him just for his own damage. But when you max him out, he gets an ability where he can latch onto a different unit. And the unit he latches onto gets a 100% damage buff, a little bit of an SPA reduction, and a little bit of a range buff. Spider-Man is very disappointing. You probably only want to use him if you're going to use a synchro, but he can like TP to enemies that are outside his range and then TP back. He does have follow-up attacks, but his damage isn't anything crazy. And when you max upgrade him, he does become full AoE and hybrid, so I guess that's something. And he has some okay support with the web traps like the synchro version, which kind of worse because all they do is slow the enemies down a little bit. I don't know. Overall, just use Spider-Man if you want to use a synchro. Don't use him for his like standalone unit. He's not very good. Now for the Persona people, okay? These ones this would be the most scuffed part of the video, because these guys have a lot going on, which is kind of cool. I like how they did the Persona units. I think they have their own like kind of gimmick gameplay-wise, which is really cool. But it's not really fun to try and explain in a tier list video with 24 units total, okay? So with the other 20 units already out of the way, we'll keep it pretty brief on these last 4 Persona people because they are pretty complicated in ways that just aren't very important for the ranking. Joker is, I think, the best one out of all of them, by far. He's actually a really solid unit. But the thing about the Persona people is you want to kind of pair them all together. Like if you run the Persona people all together on the same team, you'd probably think they're a lot stronger than they like actually are overall. So I don't know, maybe if you guys in the comments see this ranking, you're like, whoa, Joker should be number 1. Well, maybe if you run him on a full Persona team, he can do some crazy damage like up here or something, but I don't know. In overall meta, I put him like right here. He has a pretty good damage buff to units in his range. And then every Persona unit here has like their own clone they spawn in when they're max upgrade. And Joker's clone can do a lot of damage. He does some really good DPS overall. And all of these units have like an ambush mechanic, which I think is from the Persona game, so I have no idea what it really is, because I've never played Persona before. But the ambush mechanic kind of lets them do even more. Like I think Joker can freeze stuff and do even more damage. I don't know. They kind of just get like an extra burst of damage and a little bit more supporting value from the ambush or whatever. But Joker overall really strong if you pair him with the Persona units especially. And he is hybrid, so going into meta heal / hybrid. and support for his overall 100% damage buff, I think it was. Now this unit, I think her name is Anne. Of course you want to run her with Persona people because she has like the ambush mechanic, whatever. But the unit herself, she has burn, and enemies that are near her walk faster, enemies that are far from her walk slower. And then she has a clone, which, you know, just kind of in a roundabout way does more damage. So her DPS is actually pretty good. Put her into the good tier. You can always use her as like a support too. Place her far away so enemies walk slower. This guy, I forget his name, but he's a little cat thing. He's like a support for the Persona units, I think. Because every time a Persona unit attacks in his range, he's going to follow up attack with them. And once you get his clone unlocked, his damage is actually pretty good. I think this guy's mostly like a support that also tries to do damage. And it just kind of awkwardly puts him in a weird spot. But he's good on Persona teams. This guy, I forgot his name also. But he's the last one we're ranking here. Pretty good damage overall. Going into the higher end of the good tier. Just like the other Persona people, he of course has his own clone, which, you know, makes him do even more damage in a roundabout way. A very complicated passive with like 500 words. But this guy also has some supporting value, because in between attacks he can buff units in his range, but for some reason the buff goes away when he next attacks, so like, I don't know, that buff doesn't really matter. But he buffs them by like 15% damage in range. But he has some more supporting value from another buff. He's going to buff a random unit in his range for 50% damage for 10 seconds, so pretty okay buff there. Yeah, I don't know, the Persona people are very weird because they have their own like Persona mechanic of ambushing or whatever. And you want to kind of use them all on the same team to actually like see them be crazy. But for overall rankings, you know, if you don't count them being like the strong team or whatever altogether, most of them are kind of just good and not really too crazy. Here we have the final rankings. Of course, this was a very scuffed one because we're dropping 24 new units onto the tier list at once. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I got wrong or could have ranked better, or even stuff that will be changed later because it is currently bugged, or just bad. I don't know. I'm really mad about the unit designs this update. Like, some of them are really cool, don't get me wrong, but while I was looking through like passives and damage and everything for all these units trying to make this tier list, right, for all the 24 units, so many of them felt like you could tell one guy made like one of the Bleach units and then he thought, okay, I'll just do pretty much the same thing for the next guy and change a couple details. Like Rukia and Yamamoto, and a lot of units this update in a very roundabout way get like 15% hyper armor damage, and it's like, okay, what was the point? I don't know. Overall, this update was kind of a buggy mess. Okay, I'm sorry if I'm being a Debbie Downer, but like, this just stunk, okay? And making a tier list of everything we got this update just made me realize it stunk even more, so I don't know, bro. But either way, thank you to my channel members for making the video possible. You guys are the best. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope to see you next one. Have a great day.